Good day, everyone. This is Greg Tong, Vice President of Management Roundtable. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's webinar, which is entitled Next Generation R&D Metrics, How to Manage and Monitor Product Innovation for Open Innovation, Big Data, and the Cloud. Our presenter today will be Wayne Mackey, a principal at Product Development Consulting, Inc., and he joins us today from his office in California. At Management Roundtable, we've worked with Wayne for many years. He's served as chairman at a number of our conferences, and he's also one of our most highly rated speakers and workshop instructors. In fact, his next workshop on the subject of R&D metrics will be held next month in Chicago, September 24th to 25th. You can have more information on that at our company website. Now, before we begin, I do have a few quick housekeeping items to cover. Each of you should have received via email the details on how to log into the webinar portion of today's session. And for the best experience today, we also recommend that you install the Adobe Connect add-in to your computer. If you are viewing the webinar inside of a web browser, then that means you have not installed the add-on. To install the add-on, you should see a telephone icon in the upper toolbar of the browser screen. When you click on that, you can follow prompts that say connect to your computer and install the Adobe add-in. Once the program has concluded, another reminder is that we will be emailing to everyone a link to an online evaluation form, and we'd appreciate if you could take the time to fill that form out and also forward that link to anyone you have joining you for today's session. Please note that at the conclusion of today's event, everyone will receive with that email a link to where you can download a PDF copy of today's slide presentation. During today's session, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. You don't need to wait and to ask your question. You can do so at any time by typing your question into the chat window you'll see on your screen that's labeled Q&A. And once you do so, we will announce your questions into the call at the appropriate time. Please remember that if you have the slides expanded to full screen, you'll need to exit full screen mode in order to access that Q&A chat window. All right, let us begin with today's session. Once again, our presenter is Wayne Mackey, a principal at Product Development Consulting, Inc., and he's also co-author of numerous books on managing product development, including the Value Innovation Portfolio and the PDMA Toolbook for Product Development 3. Today, he's here to share his perspective on metrics. Please welcome Wayne Mackey.
Hi, well, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to join you either this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are right now. We've got a short introduction time here of an hour to tell you everything that may be useful to you in understanding predictive metrics and the idea of how to use these effectively. So as Greg mentioned, please type in questions as we go, and we'll pause in a few places in the presentation and try to address as many of those questions as we can. Okay, so let's start with who I am, just to see if this is worth listening to, if you will. Oops, wrong way. I'm part of a company called Product Development Consulting. We've been around for a little over 20 years. We work with companies that we like to say are serious about achieving measurable improvement in product development results, because an awful lot of companies that mess around with metrics aren't really serious about them at all. They write them down and they present them in meetings, but then they don't do anything at all with them. And so the types of metrics that they generate often are the cause of doing that. We are what's known as a principles-only firm, and what that means in terms of credibility in this area is that nobody works for my company unless they've worked 20 years in industry. So all of us have actually delivered product as opposed to just delivering consulting materials or theory. My particular background, I have an engineering degree as well as an economics degree, as well as over 20 years of experience, primarily in high-tech fields. As Greg mentioned, we've written a few books. Frankly, they're mostly snoozers, but the idea is that what the techniques and the tools that we use in these focus around metrics, practical tools for estimation, and establishing the ways of measuring the voice of the customer and wrapping that into requirements and needs that you can use in the real world. Okay, so enough about me. Let's start with some definitions. We're here to talk about metrics. It'd probably be a good idea to have a common understanding of what a metric is. A metric is the description of the standard of measurement that we use to assess a situation or to monitor progress towards a goal. A measurement, on the other hand, is the execution of a metric. So what this means is a metric could be, for instance, the temperature in degrees Fahrenheit in the room that you're sitting in right now. A measurement, which could occur often for that metric, could be 72 degrees, 71 degrees, etc. So that's the difference between a metric and a measurement. A metric is the standard of measure. The measurement is the execution of that metric. A result metric is a type of a metric, so that, of course, it's a description of a standard, but it assesses end items, like your return on investment, your cycle time, the number of things you shipped this month. A causal action are those things that cause the results to occur. It's a specific event or a sub-process which, if it's successful, will contribute to reaching a result or a goal that you're after. Now, a predictive or a process metric, and there's a subtle difference between the two that only people who are too involved in metrics mess with, is the description of the standard of measurement that allows us to assess causal actions. These are the things that will lead to a goal like the ones I spoke about above, return on investment, cycle time, things like that. And some examples of those would be your risk retirement rate. How fast, given the risks of a particular development, can you retire those risks? And the better you get at that, the faster you can develop. Engineering responsiveness, patent diffusion, in other words, how good your patents are and how well they diffuse into multiple products. So those are examples of predictive or process metrics. And then finally, open innovation, which we're going to talk about just a little in the context of what we're going to do here. Open innovation is the idea of buying or licensing processes or inventions from beyond the enterprise. Measuring that involves not only measuring the traditional things that we measure, but also how we choose and manage the open innovation partners that are involved. So those are some definitions just so that we're all on the same page going forward. Now, one of the first things I like to go over is the difference between a result and a predictive or a process metric and why that's important. I had the opportunity way back when I had a real job before I was a consultant to speak with the boss of the company I was working for. He was curious about what we were doing with predictive metrics and why that was changing our results in a positive way. And so this is kind of what I call the elevator talk that I gave to him. Let's say that I've decided to go on a diet. I'm going to lose 15 pounds. So the result or the goal that I'm after is to lose 15 pounds. Seems straightforward and easy to do. It's especially easy to measure that, right? You may have heard of SMART metrics. SMART means specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, and timely. And there's nothing wrong with that except people get too wrapped up around it. But the metric here would be my weight in pounds, right? It's easy to measure. How would I measure it? Well, I'd stand on a scale and record my weight. So what could possibly be wrong with doing this if I'm trying to get results? So I'm talking to the boss of my company, and he's not connecting at all with what this means in terms of predictive metrics. So I said, well, think about it. We were just in a meeting. We were talking about engineering efficiency in developing products. And we kept talking about efficiency, 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 instead of those things that are the sub-elements to that cause efficiency to happen. And so let's project the business thing back into the diet scenario, as I call it. What's wrong with this? Well, first of all, why am I trying to lose 15 pounds? Maybe I need to lose 30. Maybe I'm doing this for my health, or maybe I'm doing this for my looks. It's not connected to anything that is clear in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So that's the first thing that's wrong. But also what's wrong with this is that we're measuring the results instead of the things that cause the results to happen. And that's what makes a predictive metric predictive. So what do we do instead? If our goal or our result that we're trying to get at is to lose 15 pounds, then maybe instead of measuring our weight, what we need to start measuring is our caloric intake. Set a target of 2,000 calories a day. And what else? How do we burn those calories? Exercise time, measured weekly in a number of balls around on the idea that if we want to achieve results, we need to stop concentrating on the results and start concentrating on those things that cause the results to happen. And this is really the essence of doing predictive or process metrics. And the reason that it's powerful in a business context is that it gives decision makers and implementers an early indication before the results have gone up or down, an early indication of whether or not, of what's going on and if problems are occurring so that we can head them off before they become a gigantic disaster. So what are the questions to ask in metrics? First of all, if you don't take anything else away from this webinar, and whenever anybody talks to you or asks you about metrics, the first question out of your mouth should be, what's the goal? Because a metric without a goal is usually a waste of your time. It's just something that we're doing in addition to the real work that has to get done. So what's the goal? That's where all metrics need to start. Second, are you measuring what causes the goal to happen, or just the goal itself. Because if you watch results, what you'll get is fluctuation and often frustration. Companies I work with in metrics that's almost always pervasive is that you're measuring too many things. Now, there are a lot of different ways to measure a lot of things, but if you're measuring in any one area or one project more than 5 items, and I know that sounds like very little, more than just 5 items, then you're measuring too many things. It's hard to concentrate on it. It causes additional overhead of gathering the data, reviewing the data, and then because there's so much of it, very limited amount of time to work on any of the things that it's indicated. Is each metric watched regularly and acted upon immediately? And this is important because this takes the metrics from being some other job to being the core of the job that you're trying to get done. And then finally, this may seem counterintuitive, but could you explain it to a teenager? We don't want our professionals who are developing products that are difficult to develop and things like that to be concentrating on their metrics. They need to be concentrating on developing that product. So the metrics need to be simple. It also points to the idea that metrics have an important property, and that is the property of communication across the enterprise. If you have simple metrics that are easy to understand and well aligned to what your company is trying to achieve, then they become a great communication vehicle as to why you're doing what you're doing. So let's start with the negative side of this. How do well-intentioned metrics fail? And I tried to use an example here that would speak to something that isn't just a cliche. In fact, it's a metric that many companies are using right now, and they think they're measuring innovation this way, but there's an unintended consequence of it that's causing difficulty within companies. So first of all, let's look at the big picture. Metrics fail when they're poorly aligned, and the fix is to make that tie explicit to the upper level goals. And we use a tool called a metrics tree, which I'll show you some examples of. A second, metrics aren't owned. We want the employees closest to the work itself or the processes we're trying to measure to set their own metrics. And the tool here is causal actions. Now, this is not an open loop system. The idea is that the goals flow down. Those are a given. But let's let the people closest to the process determine what really causes those goals to occur. And this also gets buy-in and ownership to metrics, which is one of the key ways that metrics fail. And then finally, not focused. We want to continue with a systematic reduction to the critical few metrics. And we take this down to the critical 3 to 5 metrics for any one project or organization. So here's the example that I mentioned, a popular bad metric for innovation. I'm guessing that some of you in the group that are listening measure percentage of total sales from new products less than a certain age old. Well, this sounds like a good idea, right? This will tell us what's going on, and we're refreshing our products and doing things like that. So what's wrong? Remember the first question to ask in metrics. What's the goal? So goals should be tied to something that the customer or the business cares about. And you might think this makes a lot of sense to do, but what's wrong here is that we have the types of goals that we want to establish here, which is to innovate better and to be fresh. This doesn't get to it directly. And what's wrong? The types of goals that this tends to have companies achieve, if they pay attention to this metric, are to reduce their R&D payback. And why is that? Because if we start measuring and acting upon the idea of things must be newer than a year old, then there's no benefit to having a portfolio of R&D projects that goes anywhere beyond just over that bar of new products. So whatever we consider a new product becomes the highest thing we try to achieve in R&D. There's a great study by Bob Cooper, who is kind of the father of stage gate systems, of what companies do when they put this metric in. And the payback in R&D goes down, and as it goes down because their portfolio is no longer spread between high and low risk items. It's biased towards those things that are just over the bar of new products. So the type of goal you achieve, if you pay attention to this metric, is to reduce your R&D payback. Another thing you might achieve is to phase out high margin products that still own the market. This is the other side of difficulty with this metric. Let's say that you own the marketplace. You're getting huge margins on a product that you introduced a year and a half ago. This metric will tend to drive you to stop producing that product, redesign it, and do something to cause it to be a new product, an inherently bad idea. Instead of this, If we want to turn this well-intentioned metric into a metric that will actually work for us, then what we want to do is we want to look head-on at what we're trying to achieve with this metric. Maximize our return on R&D investments. So if we want to maximize our return, the first thing we have to do is that we have to force a balance of the portfolio based on customer and business needs to cover both new and existing markets, new and existing technologies, so that we have some pie in the sky, if you will, things that we're looking at that could be our big winners, as well as the everyday things that just advance us a little bit. Second, we want to optimize the flow of information throughout the enterprise. There's numerous studies that have pointed out that the biggest single use of time by development professionals is seeking information that exists somewhere. And so if we speed up information, and if in fact our product in most developments is information that we pass on to manufacturing to make a product, if our product is information, doesn't it make sense to be measuring how fast information flows through the enterprise? And then finally, speed up, second to last rather, speed up the risk retirement rate on those new technologies where we are going for those big wins. How fast can we understand what the risks are and whether or not we can conquer them? And then finally, broaden the idea or patent diffusion so that when we do spend the time and effort to develop a new product and move it forward, that we get the best use of that in other products and other items that we work with, so that we can leverage, if you will, the investment that we've made. So having talked about what it takes to screw up metrics and start off the wrong way, let's talk about what it takes to make them successful. And this has been honed over the years based on real experience with real companies. What's it take? Well, first thing, and often the step that people forget to take, is to define and connect the improvement goals. Why are we doing this? How does this fit into the company's strategy? How does this fit into the brand? How does this fit in to what we're trying to achieve both near and long term for the company? Knowing why we're doing what we're doing often points us in a better direction or a more focused direction than not. The property here is that we're aligned. Step number 2, determine the causal actions that lead to each goal. We want to make sure that instead of just measuring the results, or my weight in the diet scenario, instead of measuring that, let's measure those things that cause the results to happen. That gives us a pinpoint focus on those things that we need to be paying attention to that we may not be paying attention to if we're just focused on the results. And the property here, which is a little counterintuitive, is that it's owned. And why is it owned? Because the goals flow down to the people closest to the process. But the people closest to the process are the ones who choose the causal actions. Why? Because two things. First of all, they know the processes and what really differentiates success from failure in them. And second of all, we want these metrics to be owned by the people with buy-in closest to the actual work that goes on. We want to make certain that the folks can't back away and say, well, that's just another thing I have to do on top of my real job. What we want to do is we want to get the insight from the people who are close to the process as to what it takes to get this, to differentiate success and failure and concentrate on those things that are successful. And then finally, number 3, cut it down to the critical few causal actions, turn the causal actions into metrics, and then set our targets into the near future. Where do we think we'll be in these causal actions in the near term as we go forward trying to achieve our goal? And the property here is that we're focused. And focusing metrics is one of the most important, but yet it's the last piece of what we have to do in our metrics, is get them to the critical few, have a governance system behind it where we can watch our progress early on to make sure that we don't forget about those things that we might otherwise forget about. Now, I'll put this next slide up, but this is a good time, you can look through that as you like, this is a good time to think about some questions and a good pausing time. You've got the basics of a predictive metric system. What questions do you have?
Just a reminder, if you want to ask a question, you don't need to wait at any point during the call. You can do it at any time. Just type your question into the chat window that's labeled Q&A in your webinar screen.
Okay, and there's no questions up yet. All right. Well, I'm going to assume that that I'm being extraordinarily clear in this stuff, and we'll proceed forward. But as Greg said, type in questions as we go through. We're going to go through some more examples and talk a little bit more about how this applies in the real world with real examples from companies that have switched over from doing results type metrics into predictive or process metrics. Okay, so let's go to a metrics tree. I mentioned a metrics tree before. This is a metrics tree example. All these examples, by the way, are real and from clients of ours that have done this. I've stripped some of the specifics out and some of the numbers out to protect the innocent. But this first tree example is how we would measure a research and development portfolio. In other words, how we as it applies to R&D investments. In this case, it was research and development supplies a strategically focused funnel of innovations driving new products and services, commanding higher margins while they achieve greater market share. By the way, this is a great metric at the top level of companies that I see emerging more and more, and that is the increase in margin over market share. In other words, instead of just going after market share, which you can get by cutting your price or cutting your profit, instead measure margin over market share. Your margin has to increase as much as your market share increases, and this is a good way of growing a company. It's also, in a sideways way, an excellent measure of innovation in that in order to command high margins, especially as you gain market share, you have to be innovating things in the direction that people are willing to pay for them. Okay, so if that's the company strategy, let's flow that down to the R&D executives. What are their causal actions in order to achieve that? Well, they need to optimize the portfolio. What do we put our money into in R&D? They need to improve innovation capability across the research area. And finally, manage a balanced scorecard of results so that they're looking at the processes as well as results and things like that. That's what a balanced scorecard is all about. Those R&D executive actions turn into, with a little bit of massaging, the directors, the R&D directors' goals. So as that flows in, three things came in this company as the key directors' causal actions. Balance the mix of research projects versus cash flow. Now, what that means is that we can't just have all our projects paying off 10 years from now, or we'll go bankrupt before we get there. So we needed to balance them in this particular company against having cash flow both in the near, mid, and long term. So they wanted a portfolio mix based on aggregate cash flow, and then also based on new and existing markets and technologies. So they forced a spread of their projects so that they would pay back both near and long term, as well as be addressing new markets and new technologies, both near and long term. Second, improve information flow between research personnel and to and from knowledge databases and what they call listening posts, which is the open innovation sources that they had established through their marketing and their sales organizations. So what we want to do in this case is we want to move information faster. If our product is information in R&D, let's measure how we move it. And then finally, baseline, monitor, and implement an innovation maturity model to focus those improvement efforts. An innovation maturity model is a model similar to the Software Engineering Institute's model of what are the things that we have to do from the standpoint of starting out doing this just in an ad hoc way, moving further into the idea of optimizing a consistent and robust process. So these are the director's causal actions. The director's causal actions will turn into the director's metrics. And so we had 5 metrics covering the pieces of these causal actions. By the way we turn causal actions into metrics is we simply ask how much, how good, or when. And so that's what you'll see down here in these 5 metrics. Aggregate patent diffusion to sales, percent portfolio dollar waste beyond the funnel plan. In other words, are we leaving things in the portfolio that should have been winnowed out in the funnel with succeeding reviews? Information turns. This is a measure of how fast information moves from point of discovery to point of application in a development process. Information turns is one of the best metrics I come across in my work. It addresses directly the fact that our product is information. Let's measure how fast and how well we move it from the point where we invest in it to the point where we get paid for it. percent margin over market share gain by segment, and I mentioned this as a key metric for companies that want to grow while they're innovating. Instead of just gaining market share by cutting their prices or doing other things, they gain margin while, or they're measuring whether they gain margin while they grow, which is a better measure of how well they're innovating. And then finally, the percentage innovation maturity level gain. Innovation maturity, just for a brief explanation, is basically broken down into three parts. The innovation environment, which is a kind of a leadership type piece of doing innovation, and has to be different than development, as well as the process of ideation, coming up with good ideas and how we value them, and then incubation, which takes the ideas and moves them to a point where we understand them well enough to assign them to a real product or a real service. Okay, so I see we have some questions now. Maybe I should pause after this first tree and address some questions. So first up is percentage, this is from April, is percentage of sales for new products okay when the year is 5 years versus 1 year, or does that create the opposite challenges? Well, it's really the same problem, and it would have to, it has the same exact problem that the other metric does. It's just on a different time frame. First of all, depending on your industry's clock speed, 5 years may be way too long, which is, I think, what you're getting at in your question. But even if your clock speed is slow enough that that would still make sense, those things that you would develop, if this was your metric, would be those things that would be just over the bar for a new product. So even a 5-year-long time frame, you wouldn't be reaching for the stars. You'd be reaching for that thing that is just over the threshold of what a new development is. And I know it's kind of frustrating since this is it seems like this would be such a great metric, products less than a certain year old. The behavior it causes it tends to drive your R&D payback down. It's interesting that many companies right now are complaining about their R&D payback and trying to look for R&D efficiencies and things like that. And often the reason they have to do that is that they've intentionally or unintentionally biased themselves towards a portfolio that will not give them the kind of R&D paybacks that they used to have prior to using this metric. Okay, next question. David, what are some of the techniques used to lead an engineering organization to adopt not only new metrics, but metrics in general? Well, there's a lot of ways to do this, but probably the key piece of what I've discussed so far in accomplishing that is that we don't tell people what they measure in their causal actions. We tell them what the goal is, and they tell us what the causal actions are, and as a result of that, the predictive or process metrics that they're going to use to run their business of developing this product. There's no better way to get buy-in than to have people have their fingerprints on these metrics and, in fact, be the people who generate them in the first place. Pablo, what's your view on measuring the net present value of the innovation pipeline? This is, once again, a large subject that I can't go into in great detail. Net present value makes a great deal of sense, but we have to break down our investments into horizons. Near-term horizons, net present value makes a lot of sense for determining your portfolio because we can do a fairly good job at estimating the financial payback. Mid-term horizons, it should be a mixture of both net present value and market-type data. In other words, how strong is the customer pool for this type of thing? And then finally, long horizon items. These are the ones that will take a long time to go after. It's foolish to measure net present value on these because there's simply no way to estimate it even within an order of magnitude. And that actually goes both ways in our experience. You can have estimates that are far too big or far too small. So what do you measure instead of net present value? You measure, once again, the customer needs. How big is the need? Like there are great success stories out there, like even something as pedestrian as the Swiffer Duster, right? This is a blockbuster product. And had they measured this on net present value, they would have been comparing to the mop market, if you will, to oversimplify that. The mop market in its entirety, even if they captured 100% of the market share of that, would never have added up to what it would have taken them to develop this product. So they actually had to be working on a strong customer pool that showed them that they would not only capture all of the existing market, but they would actually double or triple the total market and capture more of that. Customer needs was the right way to measure that, and that's how they measured it, as I understand, in terms of doing that. So financials and customer needs, and near term use net present value. Next question, since we have some time here. How do you measure leadership, innovation, maturity? This has to do, well, again, a maturity model probably has 10 different items on this, but it has to do with setting the environment so that people have the ability to move small ideas into some initial level of maturity without it being reviewed. These are the little investments where you give people autonomy for a while to move these things far enough that they can be evaluated. It has to do with the types of people you hire. We've done a lot of skills work in innovation organizations, and the types of skills you need are actually very different in an innovation group. You need leaders. Those are the people who can speak well. You need strategists. These are the people who go out and listen well. So we've got speak well, listen well. You need creators, who are the people who would think out of the box and put weird things together to come up with new ideas. And then you need the testers, if you will. And these are the people who are the opposite of the creators. They take these ideas that have been put together by the creators and try to turn them into reality in terms of testing them out and understanding what the risks are and what the overall diffusion of this idea might be into real products. So how do you measure leadership innovation? You look at those elements, and that's just a handful of maybe 10 that are critical. You look at those elements and you measure success versus failure in achieving those things. Have you done your skills inventories of different types of innovators? Have you done the environment so that people can move things along without being reviewed and to a point where they've gotten at least a little bit mature? Those types of things. So those are some examples. Next up. Pablo, what about measuring hit rate? Hit rate can mean a lot of different things. The idea of hit rate would, and I'm going to just guess what you mean by hit rate here. Hit rate is, how many of your ideas actually hit the market and make their prescribed goals. Measuring hit rate is good as a goal, but it's not good as a predictive or process metric because it's necessarily looking backwards. What you want to get at is probably some things under that that would be measuring the size of the customer need, which will actually predict hit rate and give you an early indicator of success versus failure in terms of getting a better hit rate. See, measuring hit rate is a classic example of something we want to achieve, right? We want a great hit rate. But if we keep measuring hit rate, all we're going to get is fluctuation. Some products will work well, some won't. We want to get underneath that to those things that differentiate successful hits in the market versus hits that versus those things that don't hit the market. So thank you for those questions. Those are excellent questions. Let me push on. So we finished our metrics tree for the portfolio. Now let's look at it at a somewhat lower level, an engineering project, just to give you an example of how these things progress. So first of all, we start like we do with all metrics. What's the goal? So the goal here is there's a product strategy. This may sound familiar to some of you. This is rumbling around a lot of companies, is increasing product development project productivity. They want to get more for less, which is always a good thing, as long as you have some way of getting it. 20% increase in productivity over the next 3 years. So given that that was the strategy that came down from on high, that's what we're going to try to connect to. Our executive actions within the engineering organization were to increase the return on R&D, to improve new product revenue per development person, and to increase average product margin. By the way, I should mention that, it shows you where my head's at in metrics. I should mention that metrics have the property of proper level. What is the right thing for a CEO to be measuring is not the right thing for the person on the floor soldering parts to a prototype board. And vice versa, by the way, right? What we measure has the property of level. And so when you see things like this up at the executive level, these are the appropriate things for an executive to be measuring. They would not be the appropriate things for the person who's designing a circuit to measure, and vice versa. So let's go on. So if those are the executive actions, then those translate into the directors who report to them, their goals. So what are the types of things? And again, these are real examples with just some wording change to protect the company's anonymity. Reduce the dollars invested in programs which are canceled in the gate process. In other words, earlier cancellation of bad projects. This particular company had kind of the opposite of the just say no scenario in stage gates. Everything always passed. What they did is they enforced a more robust look at failing those things that actually were telling you they should be failed. Second, reduce development project cost slips versus the original plan, that was the standard of measure, if you will, through greater rigor in project management disciplines. These folks went back to basics within the project organization, went back to the program manager's book of knowledge and things like that to go back to the basics of program management so that they were able to do a better job of managing their projects. And then finally, reduce the time to profit for the project by speeding up the cycles of learning. If you create an expertise in cycles of learning, and that's a word, three words that are catching on more and more with companies, is how fast do you learn? So rather than doing serial development, which stage gate systems tend to have you concentrate on, rather than doing that, we want to do a series of shorter feedback loops, if you will. Those short feedback loops where we learn a little bit, make changes, learn a little bit more, make changes. It makes you more flexible. It also works well in an open innovation environment. If we're going to use information that comes from the cloud, if we're going to use information from social networks to understand what our customers care about, we need to be iterating more often so that we can adjust as the information comes through. So that's what this company did. If those are the engineering director's actions and the project manager's goals, the project manager looks at those goals and says, okay, so what do I do if I'm the project manager? I want to implement aggregate resource planning as an early gate criteria. If we're not using our resources properly, we need to feed that to the gate system so that we can cancel projects that aren't going to succeed. Improve target costing tools and disciplines. Improve product definition methods and track the requirements changes. And improve the risk retirement rate across the project, testing, and the integration plan. If those are the actions, we turn causal actions into, by the way, at each level of this tree where you see actions, those turn into metrics. I'm just using one level of them for the metrics here. These causal actions for the project manager turn into the project metrics. So we have a total of 5, resource plan versus actuals, target cost plan versus actuals, requirement change percentage and when those requirements changed occurred, risk retirement and integration schedule slip rate, and then the percentage of folks who are trained, and then hours per standard task. Once they're trained, do we improve how long it takes them to do standard tasks underneath that? Relatively causal action, result or goal relationship right up to the product strategy. Everybody knows why the project's doing these things and how they contribute to the product strategy. Okay, so this next slide is actually an important one because it shows the interplay. I'd hate to have anyone leave this webinar and say, well, you know, we listened to this idiot, Wayne Mackey, on a webinar, and he says that we should forget about results and just concentrate on process metrics. And nothing could be further from the truth. We want to run our business on the process metrics, but we want to tie that together with the results because what we're really trying to achieve, of course, is results. The counterintuitive piece of this is if we want to achieve better results, we have to stop concentrating on the results as much and start concentrating more on the things that occur that cause the results to happen. So I put together this slide to kind of illustrate that point. So we'll start like we do with all metrics. What's the goal? So we got our goal up there. That's the trophy. That's the first question we ask. That's what we're trying to achieve, and we have a certain amount of time to achieve it. We start up like we do in many projects. We measure our process metrics. We're measuring these things that occur both early and often relative to the goal. And early on, we find out that things go well for a little while, but then they went south a little bit. Because we have this early information, long before we'd see any change in the actual results or end goal, we can make adjustments, move resources, do something that fixes the problem early before it becomes a raging firestorm. And then we go on. Things go well, and then once again we see a problem. And because we're in these tight little feedback loops getting early information, we can find out what's going on, fix the problem, and continue on up. So this goes on, but what I like to do is on a ratio of about 8 to 1, every 8 times we do a process metrics review, we do a results metrics review. And the nature of a results review is it's a more formal review. Process metrics reviews should only take about 15 minutes every 2 weeks, and it's a peer-type review. A results metrics review is a more traditional review where we look to see, are we making the progress we expected on the results using the predictive or process metrics that we've set up? And the answer there, if we're not, is not to start banging on the table and focus on results. It's to redo our predictive or process metrics and adjust them so that they will give us the results we want. For instance, in the diet scenario, if I'm measuring my weight, if I'm measuring my caloric intake, I'm measuring my exercise, and I'm doing all those, and those things are all working right, and then I got on the scale a couple of weeks later and I've gained weight, then it doesn't mean I shouldn't be watching my calories or exercise. What I have to do is reassign the goals. I may have to exercise more to burn more calories or cut down on the calories. The purpose of the results review is to ensure that we have a tight relationship between the results we're trying to achieve and the process metrics that we use to run the business. And so we make the adjustments in the results review, and then we move on, doing the same things that we've done before. In these tight little feedback loops, we measure our process metrics, we find problems early, we complete those actions that it takes to fix them, and that's how we achieve our goal. You'll notice in a scenario like this, if you have a culture right now of heroes, where people come burning in at the end and they put out all these huge fires and things, this type of metric actually requires fewer heroes. What it requires is people to be paying attention to the small things and moving forward on fixing those before they become a raging firestorm. Okay, before I go on to the next one, I have another question up here, so let's pause for a moment. Pablo, could you please give an example of resource planning as a gate decision criteria? Sure. In study after study, we find that when there are resource issues in a company, they have to do mostly with either the wrong people or the wrong number of people being assigned to the project in the early to mid phases of the project. Not at the end, because when the project's on fire, there's all the resources in the world for it. In fact, that's what's pulling the resources from the early phase project. So how do you measure this? We measure we do a resource plan versus time in the early and mid phases of a project, and we track that we not only have the right number of resources on the project that we planned for early on, but also that they're at the right skill and seniority level to get the job done. And so this is an excellent metric that more and more companies are doing in terms of resource planning in the early gates. So in an early gate, you would be reviewing the plan for resources versus what you've actually got working on the project and moving it forward. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit. The purpose of this is to go into R&D metrics. So let's talk about some differences. If at your company, you're measuring research the same way you measure development, then you probably need to think that over again, because inherently research has some different criteria to it than development. So let's first of all define what I mean by research. Research is where we're looking into a new technology or a new business model, something that hasn't been done before, prior to it being assigned to a particular project. Now, I know these things often overlap in the real world. I'm not naive. But the idea is that research needs to be looking at those things differently than a product development, which has a set schedule, a set product delivery, and things like that. So let's look at the differences. First of all, when it comes to results metrics or goals, where we would measure development schedule, we want to measure research risk retirement rate. It's a much better metric of how well we're researching than the schedule of what we're doing. This gives us much more insight as to whether we're researching efficiently or not, rather than just a schedule. Development cost, actually, instead of measuring development cost, if we're measuring research, we should measure what's known as real option value. And real option value has to do with and it's a complicated subject. You can Google it if you want more information. But the idea is we want to be looking at how much time and money, or how much money does it take us to learn a given amount about this new technology. If I can advance the knowledge on a new technology by investing very little, as opposed to investing a whole lot, then that's a superior cost in development. In other words, we want to look at those things where it takes us the least amount of money to advance the knowledge about the risk, if you will, the most amount. And this is another criteria that we use, and a good way of measuring the value of our research in terms of $1 in gets me how many dollars of information out. Next, quality. So I did schedule cost quality, where development quality would translate into research information, breadth, and depth. And this is a little bit counterintuitive in that the idea is that we may have, in quality in development, we have escaped errors, escaped software bugs, things like that. But in research, what we really want to know is we've looked into this, but there's a big difference in quality of research if it's one person taking one piece of data in one lab versus we're researching the same technology, let's say. It's 5 different pieces of data from 2 different labs, one of which is an environmental lab, and having been reviewed by experts in 3 different areas. You see the depth of the information that we're using to make decisions about whether or not this technology will work or not is really a measure of the quality of the research. So what we want to do is understand how much data there is behind the things so that we can make logical decisions based on that. So given that those are results that we might want to do and look at differently, let's look at the causal actions. We want to improve information turns, and I've alluded to that already. This, by the way, is analogous to inventory turns in a factory, where in a factory you buy a bunch of parts, you add value to them, and then you get paid for them. And a measure, this is an oversimplification, but a measure of how fast that occurs is inventory turns. Every good factory measures its inventory turns. Information turns, since our product in product development is information, is just the analogy of that. How fast do we move information from point of discovery to point of use and getting paid for it? Next up, increase the idea or patent diffusion. Now, don't get me wrong, we're not measuring patents here. In fact, that's one of the poster children of lousy metrics. What we want to do is we want to measure how good the patents are, which is the type of behavior that actually tells us something about the quality of what we're doing in terms of research. Implement best-in-class bounds of decision autonomy. This is a fancy way of phrasing the idea of evaluating an idea and killing it too early. Maintain stable research-specific funding. Now, many companies, when there are cutbacks overall, then things get cut back in research. At the best companies with the best return on investment, if you will, for innovation and research, the research-specific funding is a constant. In fact, I once spoke to a CEO, and he said that I cut the innovation funding just before I turned the lights out in the plant. And so the idea is this is your future, and so although it is a small percentage of the total of the company, it is something that should be preserved as opposed to cut back. Improve the professional network size and quality. This speaks to the research information breadth and depth that I spoke about above. And then finally, optimizing the idea pipeline. How do we get better ideas in by having a criteria established that gives us better ideas in and a better way of evaluating them objectively? And then recursive technology demonstration. How do we turn the key characteristics of a new idea into something more rapidly using shorter cycles of learning as opposed to longer? So let me put this up as a dashboard. Patent or idea diffusion. These are kind of the critical few. Cycles of learning, which is related to risk retirement rate. Idea pipeline, the hurdle rate, target versus actual. In other words, how good of a return, either measured in customer needs or measured in net present value, how good of a return does it take for an idea to make it through the pipeline? And the higher that number is, that's a measure of the quality of your ideas. Information turns, which we've already discussed. Listening posts, network breadth. How do we get the information from points of use, especially outside of the company? How do we leverage our marketing and sales offices and things like that to actually bring in ideas and bring in solutions? And then finally, decision autonomy applied versus the best in class. BIC is best in class. So to simplify a lot of what I've talked about so far, here's your dashboard of 6 good ideas for measuring improved research and innovation. Let's say that we want to improve worldwide development partnering, which is a subject of this webinar, the idea of doing this worldwide. First of all, information turns just externally now. Same thing applies. Native intellectual property utilization is critical. If we're going to build a partnership, we want to be able to build a partnership of people who have already developed the things that are the constituent parts of what we want to finally put together. If we can find somebody who's developed all the individual parts and put that together as a partnership, then our only difficult job is the system integration and putting it together. The closer we get to 100% existing IP by building a partnership, the quicker the development, the lower cost the development is. Bandwidth match, we want to make sure that we're matching the bandwidth required with our partners versus the bandwidth we use. One of the challenges for those of you who have worked with, especially international partners, is that it's no fun getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning for a conference call because it happens to be their business hours. Much of what we do in meetings across a partnership can easily be done via email, which makes it schedule flexible. And that's a bandwidth match, one example of a bandwidth match across a partnership that makes the partnership work better. Partner selection and management controls. We want to make sure that we not only have a good way of selecting our partners, but also of managing the partnership once it's under contract. And finally, integration test schedule slip rate. Schedule slip rate means we have these items listed in our project plan for what we're going to do to integrate this project across the different partners. And as we either make that date or we don't. The slip rate is a very yes or no type of thing. We made it by that date. We didn't make it by that date. So we set up a series of milestones for integration, and we measure whether or not we're on schedule with it. Gives us an early indication of whether this product is going to go together well and have sufficient time to do the testing and integration that's required. Okay, let me go. I have another question over here. Let me address that because our time's getting short. April, I don't understand the meaning of risk retirement rate. Good question. Those new technologies are untested. A company that's just kind of scratches their head and says, well, maybe we'll give that to Frank and Sally and see if they can go figure out whether this stuff, whether this risk is worth doing. So there's no system there. It's strictly ad hoc, and it depends on Frank and Sally's expertise in doing it. A company that addresses risk retirement rate better, so their risk retirement rate would be all over the map. It would be long, and it would probably be all over the map, and the quality of it would also be relatively low. Compare that to the company that has a rigorous process of identifying the key characteristics of technology risk, has testing programs both in an environmental lab so that they can accelerate their learning in terms of life cycle and things like that. When they hit this, they know exactly how to identify the key characteristics of development. They know exactly how to test them to give them early indicators of the long-term effects of this technology and what it might do. Their risk retirement rate will be not only faster, but more predictable in terms of their successes. Okay, open innovation. We're talking about open innovation. A bubble chart's a classic way of looking at how we do open innovation and how we do portfolios in general. So let's say that what we're after here is we want to use open innovation when we have a new business model, existing technology. So why would we go outside the company in terms of open innovation on that? We want to go outside because we don't have, because the technology we know, but we're giving it to folks in a different marketplace. So we would use open innovation for channels. And the little AB there would be two different projects, say, that would fit into that mold. If we're existing business models and existing technology, the only reason we don't want to do that inside is for capacity. We simply don't have enough people to do it. If we have new technology, but we're selling to the same customers, then we want to use open innovation for capability. So if we don't know the technology and somebody else does, we put together open innovation and our partnerships around the technology, but we use our folks in terms of getting into the channels. And then finally, if we're new technology, new business models, this is going to be inherently more difficult to do. And the main reason we want open innovation is for speed. We need both channels and capability, and doing that ourselves would have a tremendously long learning curve. Putting it together with an open innovation environment is a much improved way of getting better time to market. Okay, so the size of the bubble with different companies in terms of how they measure it can represent a lot of things. It can be the project investment, it can be the project payback, or the net present value if we're in the near-term horizon, or the amount of risk. So these are different ways of measuring what we're doing in open innovation to address different challenges in the types of things that we're developing. All right, now the last three slides I have, I know we're about out of time. The last three slides are actually more of a reference for you in terms of a checklist. I mentioned there are 3 steps to success: the goals, the causal actions, and cutting it down to the critical few. So let me go directly through those real quickly. When we think about goals, and you know that's the first question to ask in metrics, does it clearly define the desired result or end state? Could you explain it to a teenager? Is the path from this to the bigger picture goal, like the company goal, explicitly shown? Is it specific and relevant to the level and organization responsible to meet it? Is it realistic? Which means both two things, actually. Do we have the capability, and what does the market demand in this? Because even if we don't have the capability, we may need open innovation so that we're able to meet the marketplace demand for this level of performance. I have a thing called the ketchup test. That is this goal specific to your situation, not just do good things, add shareholder value? Because you could say the same thing about a ketchup company. There's nothing wrong with ketchup, but we want our goals to speak directly to our situation. Next up, causal actions. Does your experience show a cause-effect relationship to the goal? When I say your experience, these are the people closest to the process. Is each action different than the failed way you tried to do this in the past? If not, is there a deeper root cause? Is it different than the goal? We don't want to be thinking of a causal action as weight if I'm trying to achieve weight reduction. Is it early and often relative to the goal? That's what makes it predictive. Can it be objectively evaluated for success? We don't want to use abstract language where we say, well, this is easy to do, or types of things, because easy means something different to everyone. Are the actions right work rather than hard work? We don't want to measure how many hours people are putting into it. We want to see whether those hours are resulting in the types of things that we need. Are they resistant to inappropriate behavior? Make no mistake, I've seen more metrics than any human being should. And the idea is that any metric can be gamed, so we want to make sure that we make it less easy to game a metric. So we don't want to pit one organization against the other. You're not in competition with any area of your company. You shouldn't be measuring your success by being better than another part of your company. And then finally, not easily gamed. And finally, simplicity. This is the last of the 3 steps. Would your otherwise competent organization succeed if it succeeded at these critical few actions? Are they prioritized so that we only do have the critical few? And then for each process metric, we want to have somebody who establishes how we're going to measure it and bring that data to the process review. Is there a target so we know where we expect to be next month, the month later, month after that? Is there a governance or review plan to watch it regularly and act upon it immediately? And that's it for the reviews. So with that, what I've done is I've given you kind of a very short version of a very big subject in metrics. So hopefully this whet your appetite and maybe provided some value around what to look for and what to ask for in metrics. Okay, I don't see any additional questions up. Anything else from anybody if you'd like to type it in now? If not, I'll turn this over to Greg to close us up.
Yeah, we will hold for just a moment or two to see if there's any leftover questions from anybody. So type those in now if you do have them. I don't see anybody typing in, so why don't we close out? And you can always contact Wayne offline as well if you have any, I guess, what some people are saying. I think there's one more question there.
There we go.
Will the presentation be made available? Yeah, as I said at the beginning, you will each receive a email at the conclusion of today's call. It'll have a link to the evaluation form as well as a link to a PDF copy of today's slides. All right, why don't we end there? And we have reached the end of our time, so I'd like to give a big thanks to Wayne Mackey for sharing his time with us today. And as I just mentioned, please keep your eye out for that email that'll have a link to the online evaluation form as well as a link to today's slides. Also, please do share that and forward it to anyone in your group who joined you for today's call. If you're interested in the workshop coming up next next month in September in Chicago, you can find information on that on the Management Roundtable website. Just go to managementroundtable.com. Again, thanks to Wayne for his time today, and thanks to all of you for sharing it with us. I hope to see you again at a future Management Roundtable event. Goodbye, and have a great day.
Hey, thank you all.